Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Trusted CI webinar for March 23rd, 2020. I'm your host, Jeanette Dopheide. Trusted CI is the NSF Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, and these webinars are part of its mission to deliver high-quality, actionable guidance regarding cybersecurity to the NSF community. More information about Trusted CI can be found at trustedci.org. Today's topic is OnTimeURB with Prasad Calyam. OnTimeURB is a multi-cloud broker framework for creation of secure and high-performance science gateways. Prasad is an associate professor in the Department of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science at the University of Missouri-Columbia. Before we begin, I have a few things to note. First, this presentation is being recorded. Second, participants are welcome to ask questions during the session using the chat box, and you can find the chat box in the Zoom application. Click on chat, start typing your question there. And we will leave time at the end of the presentation for questions as well. And with that, I will hand the presentation over to Prasad. Prasad, welcome.
Good morning, everybody. I'm excited today to talk to you about this project we've been working on for the last couple of years. And the beginnings of this project have been over the last 3-4 years. And hopefully all of you can see my slides.
Yep, I can see your slides, look good. That's
great. So the project that I'm going to present today is actually a nice team project between a very multidisciplinary group with Trupti Joshi, who does bioinformatics, Isa, who does usability. She's from the School of Education. Saptarshi, who's my postdoc, now is a tenure track professor at Hunter College in CUNY, and Tim Middlecoop, who's Director of Research Computing at University of Missouri. So this is a very interdisciplinary project with both an academic side and an applied practice side, really looking at how we can build science gateways that are high performance and secure. And we have a number of graduate students. Some of them are on this webinar, Ashish, Samaikya, Kanupriya, Min, Soumya, Ramya, Mauro, Enme. So all of them have contributed to what I've prepared to talk today. And my talk really comes from the fact that we have data intensive applications today that really are looking for on-demand resources everywhere, right? So a local campus HPC center, like in the past, is not sufficient to really service all the needs of scientists today. And we're looking for remote instruments, collaborators at different, remote universities or labs. And we're using, community clouds, public clouds. We're setting up our own clouds to federate with these other remote resources. And we have these programmable technologies that make it all possible, right? We can do very virtualized resources at very large scale and almost make these collaborations seamless. And the way we are designing these applications has also evolved. So in the past, when we were building these kind of applications, in the classic computing paradigm, we would build a system, make it work. We would say how many people would need this system, how many times will they use it, when will they use it, and by the way, let's add some security. And today, we are more worried about security, even before we put a system in production. So we are always worrying about who can do what. Right, in today's webinar, Jeanette was saying, in Zoom, there is a setting where if we didn't properly configure a setting, somebody could take over the screen of the presenter. So before we do anything live today or in production, we are worrying about security much more than we have. And in the cloud era, security vulnerabilities can be amplified. And so we have to be very careful how we design systems from both a security standpoint as well as performance standpoint. So the design has to really look at both these aspects very closely. And that's kind of what motivates our project is, how do we look at these systems from both a technical standpoint of view as well as a social standpoint of view, or a usability standpoint of view and performance standpoint of view, while also taking into consideration all the security requirements. So this is a kind of a funny cartoon where, there's always this argument, which is more important, security or usability. In a perfect world, we want it to be both balanced, right? And we don't want these sort of ridiculous things of going through security loopholes where the performance is, almost rendered useless. So we want to really bring security and performance in a co-design manner that then helps us build these federated distributed applications that we are all using today. So with that, I'll sort of give you the outline of my talk. So my research talk today I will give is motivated by some application use cases or science gateways. One is a bioinformatics workflow application called KBCommons. Another one is the health information sharing science gateway. We call it the honest broker application. So I'll talk about that. So I'll give you these motivations that lead us to kind of understand where these frictions between security and performance are, how resource policies of different providers need to be aligned with the requirements of users who have very different performance, security, usability requirements. And in the solution, we'll kind of talk about how we are dealing with these problems for these applications in a general way, how we think about brokering as a solution to deal with these security performance requirements, and how we can formalize these requirements, align them with the policies of providers who have very heterogeneous policies across different domains, and really optimize and allocate resources to these science gateway applications. And in the last part, I'll give you some sample experiments we have done, some findings for both these applications, where we show that this multi-cloud brokering, if done well, has cost, performance, and other security benefits. So for the first part of my talk, I want to motivate these use cases that really give us the multi-cloud needs that require brokering. And the way we look at this problem is, most of the applications today, as I said, we are looking for use of federated resources, and we all have a life cycle of how our application progresses as we do processing, collecting data, sharing. And as you can see from this picture, the steps really go through multiple domains. So you might go to a microscope and get some image data. You might process it on your local HPC cluster, or take it to a remote cyber infrastructure like Cybers, and you would do a lot of analysis, and then you would probably want to archive or share or provide web access to those kind of processed data. So you're going to be using a number of different resource providers at each stage of your data life cycle. And as you're processing this data, you have different concerns about security. Is my data going to be overwritten? Are my licenses going to be abused? Will I lose access to my data because somebody said, after 60 days, we don't keep your data anymore? So there's a lot of these concerns of, availability, confidentiality, integrity that we worry about as the data leaves our, boundary of where we control our domain, right? And for that reason, we know that universities are very much discouraging people to really go use external resources. Obviously, there's intellectual property issues, but also the fact that we can't control once the data leaves our domain, where we understand the policies, or we have people really helping us operate those. We get into the areas where we are not sure what's going on. And so our division of IT, for example, has put out this policy, make sure you don't really go out or put your information on Dropbox or whatever, right? Use the box that's approved and used by the university IT groups and supported by the IT groups. So there are all these sort of security concerns when you're trying to go outside your domain, where you can control the security and performance. But in reality, we want to be able to go outside, because that's how our applications are evolving. And one of the exemplar applications is the KBCommons Science Gateway. It started from a project called SoykB on Cybers and uses Open Science Grid, and it's been featured in Open Science Grid as one of the exemplar applications for how bioinformatics can be done using these scientific workflows and science gateways. And it has been used and developed today, so that you can see there are several workflows that are in the tab. I can see in the screenshot here, RNA-seq alignment. So there are many, many more workflows today that helps non-experts who are bioinformatics people, non-experts in computation, to basically easily select a workflow, pick a resource outside their domain, set up the processing that could involve data transfers and execution of large sort of data sets on computational resources. So here is kind of a little bit more architectural setup of the application. The data is from the left side, you can see input into a pre-processing step, and then there's a lot of data transfer that happens where we go to Cybers or Amazon or other kind of multi-cloud resource providers. And then the processing is done using Pegasus and other sort of toolkits that can provide us high throughput computing at very large scale. And the process data is put into these portals where people are able to access these data sets through whatever devices they're using. And it could involve data transfers and processing of a lot of data that takes a lot of time to execute on these distributed resources. And as this processing is happening, and this is a very important area in the bioinformatics field of genomic data processing, obviously there are fears of how this data itself can be used for identification, discrimination of individuals who have these stereotyped genetic information medically. Also, there is worry that we want to preserve the privacy across the whole life cycle of data processing, and how do we do that is a concern. And as we use multiple cloud providers, we want to make sure that there is synergistic policies, so that we can actually assume what the workflow is supposed to do and how it's secure, and also the providers are providing the necessary capabilities for our assurance, right? So obviously there are concerns, and providers have their own ways of doing things, right? So they have different capabilities, and here's just an example. We're showing, if you wanted to run a workflow and you're trying to pick between different cloud providers, they all have a different set of capabilities they provide. So if you're trying to FISMA-related compliant workflows, you shouldn't be using Google, right? But if you're using something with HIPAA, you could use Amazon or Azure and Google. All of them are compliant. So if you're running it through multiple providers, you have some sort of a check that you're going to have the security you're assuming on the provider side. And in a realistic sense, the problem is much more complex, right? So we obviously want these functional criteria from the providers, right? We want some storage, network, computing, GPU, some kind of software stacks. But at the end of the day, the users are really looking to optimize what we call as Q specs, the quality specs. They want high security, they want high performance, they want to have high agility, that they can manage their applications much more easily through automation. And obviously at the end of the day, they are worried about cost. And they're trying to optimize their functional criteria with a lot of these non-functional criteria, and the list kind of gets more complicated, right? As we add security, performance, agility, and cost, each provider has different capabilities. Users have different preferences, and so it becomes really a very difficult, overwhelming problem when we are asked to do security and performance and pick amongst different providers. And have the right configured resources, have the right security issues dealt across the different cross-domain lifecycle collaboration. So with that, I think hopefully you've been given enough information that you know multi-cloud brokering is sort of a little difficult problem if you're a bioinformatics application user. We'll show you another application. This is a more healthcare data sharing application. It's a science gateway we call as the honest broker application. In this case, the problem is not finding computation resources outside your domain, but here you're trying to find data sources outside your domain. You're trying to bring data and then do computation. And I was talking to a cardiologist a couple of days back with the coronavirus pandemic. We have a lot of people are wanting access to a lot of data sets, and it's very difficult to get these data sets. These data sets are actually public in some sense, but they're protected. And the cardiologist was saying that we contribute to this database, and when we want data from the database, we're having trouble getting data. And kind of the reason is that the protected data requires a lot of auditability assurance and IRB, and the provider really has to have a governance on what's happening when they share their data. So it's not so easy as, I'm giving you data, give me back a lot of data, right? There's a whole overhead to giving the data. And if the problem people are posing with the data is not exciting enough, they'll say, well, we don't want to deal with that overhead. So for example, the cardiologist said, he had to fill out a form, tell what he wanted to do with the data related to coronavirus, sort of a pandemic issue. And they basically said, well, we have already somebody looking at it. So, unless you have a newer problem, don't come asking us for data. So, so these are the other kind of systems where we're looking at science gateways where we want to get data from multiple sources, and each of those sources have, again, policies of how the data should be shared or used, and what transactions can happen on the data. And usually it requires some kind of a committee review that look for all the compliance on IRB and HIPAA. And then there's a lot of data that needs to be given back to the user so that they can do all these analyze and visualize tasks. And so you can do very interesting things. I talked about this coronavirus as a use case. We actually worked with a person who does a lot of ophthalmology research, who wanted to study these databases for understanding age-related cataract diseases from a large database called Cerner Health Facts that we have at the University of Missouri that holds about 60 million patient records and billions of transactions of patient and doctor interactions. So in such a kind of application, as I said, the security issues or privacy issues are going to be very different, and the problem here is essentially the loss of value and loss of opportunity. What I mean by that is people who are sharing the data are worried about trusting the people who use the data. So if I give you data, you make a copy, Cerner says, our value of data went down by 50%, right? So you made a copy, I could have sold it to 2 people. If you put up all these barriers to get the data, if I give you the data 6 months after you asked for it, that's a loss of opportunity. The data is no more as valuable as when it was actually originally asked. So when you have this slow accessibility, you again have a loss of opportunity, and that's kind of what's happening today. So if you're asking for protected data, a lot of these systems have a lot of processes. In fact, it's very hard to know what exactly the user asked when he asked for the data. And by the time the data is given to the user, sometimes this manual processes take a long time. And again, how can we broker these data sources and make it more faster and secure is another kind of problem. That basically is solved by this idea of an honest broker that today is completely done by manual processes. And as I said, with this ophthalmology use case, it would take 24 minutes to run a very basic program on this database. If you wanted to run more complex programs, it will take 3-4 days. And just even in the beginning to get the data, it takes several months. Because there's all these data sharing, negotiation, compliance, and governance issues that are part of it. So the other last motivation for how we really start looking at our research problems are that the policies that people have for both the data side computation side are again done by committee, right? So people sit down and decide, we'll call this restricted, we'll call this internal, we'll call this sensitive, and they come up with pages and pages of guidelines. And what we have seen is, the University of Missouri has a 5-page security guideline. Ohio State has 150 pages. And they use all these different words that could mean the same or could be different. It's up to the users to really understand what they're saying and work with the providers. So again, that's a sort of an overwhelming problem when you're trying to understand the policies of different providers and their interpretation of policies that is usually done by a committee. So with that, I hope I gave you a good sense of the types of problems we're looking at or the issues that are underlying the science gateways when you're trying to access federated computational resources or federated data sources that you need to do your science. And the way we want to think about as a solution framework is this intelligent brokering, where we want to understand what are the requirements of security and performance, and we want to really align them through a sort of a formalized set of policies and requirements so we can actually provide the resources and optimize them. And so here is a graphic that kind of summarizes how we want to think about this problem. We think of it as an inter-conflict problem. So I talked about QSpecs, which is what the users are asking for. Mostly they are non-functional requirements. And there are resource policies that providers have depending on what resources they're providing, data or licenses or computation. And then there are basically these SSpecs that we want to consider from a user perspective. So the user has some security specifications and we're wanting to align them with the policies of the providers. And as we are aligning them, we want to make sure that the performance is not being affected. In reality, they all actually are working against each other. So there's a friction when we specify these requirements and we look at the policies, they don't always easily align. The problem is really how do we automate this, right? So how do we make this more seamless and how do we resolve these conflicts in a way that we can synergize the design of the system? So that's the premise for our OnTimeURB, which is the brokering middleware we've been working on. We want to be able to have this be a middleware that can help any general problem. And in a general sense, we're looking at these 4 steps that we would do. So we need to be really smart in collecting the requirements of security and performance. So what the users say needs to be understood in a very clear way, so we can actually then map it to the resource policies. And really we have to understand how resource policies are specified. And as I said, it's done by committee and it's pretty hard to really know what people are saying. So we need some way of having a standard to really check against, right, in terms of how the policies are giving certain different compliance requirements. And then we have to come up with ways in which we can make this more synergistic, how we align the performance and security requirements of the users to the capabilities policies of the providers. And at the end of the day, we want to provide these resources to non-experts, so people who don't really are fully knowledgeable in workflows and distributed computing and dealing with all this complexity of the cloud. We want to make it easy for them to ask and get resources, and we want to optimize it for all the things they want to optimize for, all the non-functional requirements. So in that sense, we did this work about 3 years back, which was the beginning, and we're kind of building on this concept. As you can see, it's a numbered sequence diagram of steps. So we have an interface at the beginning that's collecting the requirements. and it's formalizing those requirements as SSpecs, QSpecs, RSpecs from the provider policy as well as the user requirements. And then we do this sort of a alignment and resource allocation optimization, which then goes to the allocation part of deploying these resources and monitoring those resources and providing users with an ability to basically see if their performance security requirements are being met. So it has a lot of components to the solution, a lot of different interfaces, which is why we have the usability researcher who's Isa's team that's working with us to help us understand how do we do each of these steps, right? How do we make it easy for the user to express the requirements? How do we understand what motivates resource providers to put these policies up that maybe are alignable sometimes and maybe not sometimes, and how do these interfaces that provide visibility to this workflow system, right, with the alignment, how can we design those for the users to know and maybe even change their preferences or non-functional requirement needs to optimize the system. So there's a lot of social and technical aspects that are involved in the system. And I'm just giving you a few examples. I won't go into much details, but the way we want to look at how we collect the requirements, right? So what are the RSpecs and QSpecs from a user perspective? We want to think about users as obviously who are knowledgeable to give us some functional requirements, but we also want to understand their non-functional requirements as well. So we have a questionnaire method that is going to be different if you're an expert or a novice. So how do we know somebody is an expert or novice? Again, we've been working on many ways. We can ask the user, or based on the answers they're giving us, we can guess. And we have sort of a chatbot, or actually can even do a conversation dialogue to profile users. So we've done different kinds of experiments, but the idea is to have a knowledge interface system so we can understand the user preferences and know, is it from an expert or a novice user. And here's a similar kind of interface for collecting the requirements for the honest broker application. It's a set of questions. Some are obvious, some could be a little bit more probing of understanding what the user is saying. And the next step, we want to formalize the security requirements. So as I said, everybody has policy by committee kind of a way. Nobody really sits down and says, here are the NIST guidelines of how we really need to define it. And that's not the way people do it. But ideally, that would be a great way if everybody standardized how they made their policies. But in our scenario, we are trying to bridge that gap. So we are able to look at a given set of requirements, break it down into data requirements, auxiliary requirements, and really map them to these 18 security categories that NIST guidelines provide. And we can basically then say a given requirement falls under, say, high, moderate, or low in terms of the security requirements. And so we have a security specs kind of on the left side here, and all the requirements are shown on the right side from the NIST guidelines. And the next step is, so we are able to then break down into the data and auxiliary requirements. Then we can actually start doing this sort of more formal way of aligning the requirements. So we have done a few different iterations of this using Portune's algebra, some sort of natural language processing that's involved in interpreting the policies. And an example is given here. So if it's a health facts database to access data, a policy for compliance with HIPAA might have a requirement, and then we might say, if that request then is a sensitive request, or is it a more low risk request that can be provided data access very easily without much manual governance. You can do all these sort of checks and compliance based on those requirements, and ultimately we can put them into some sort of a mapping, right, of how the resources are compatible or not compatible. So here we're showing sort of a multi-cloud scenario. There are different cloud providers. Once we have gone through this alignment process, we can come up with sort of an interoperability matrix that says, these CSPs are actually okay for this workflow, and they are all compliant, and so the user can pick any of these one of these options of providers. And at that, really looking for optimizing non-functional requirements. So they're interested in cost, they're interested in security, they're interested in agility, they're interested in performance, and not all of those can be satisfied. So our goal is once we have this alignment and we understand interoperability, we are able to provide users with choices. Right? We are able to give them a red option, green option, gold option. So the red option is, it's going to be your cheapest option. You have to do security all by yourself, right? The green option is we'll do everything for you. It's going to be very pricey. The gold option is somewhere in the middle, right? It has the balance between the red option and the green option. So we want to be able to, again, as we do the provisioning and optimization, we want to have the ability to have the users choose what profile of security or performance or cost or agility would be satisfiable, right? What makes them happy, and we could then incorporate those into the interfaces. So here is the interface Ashish developed for the KBCommons for a given workflow, and then they can basically automate their workflow after that. And for the honest broker side, like I said, the same idea that once we have understood how the requirements match with the different policies, what we want to here enable is for the data provider or the data custodian to have the ability to say, is this a low risk request? Is this a high risk request? And how do we essentially optimize this, what we call it the efficient frontier, right? So how do we give this data access if we think there's low risk, or how do we add more steps to the data access if we think it's high risk? And we kind of use this idea of investing in a diverse security strategy. So we want to basically have a combination. So if we think encrypting and notifying the data owner is as beneficial as actually having a manual request, we might automate that process, right? Or we might just give timed access to the data, or we might give access to the data, notify the administrator. So it could be all of these different actions we can take to make sure that the loss of opportunity, loss of value is balanced. So this is another way we can make a decision based on the alignment, is let the data custodian decide what sort of risk this request has and what steps need to be taken to provide access. So in the last part, I'll give you a few sort of experiments we have done and some findings, and you can have some question answers. And I'll give you these experiments for both the sort of use cases that I mentioned in the beginning, for the bioinformatics workflow science gateway application, also the data sharing application. So our implementation of our OnTimeURB middleware, as I said, looks like this, and you can see it all coming together. So on the left, we have the KIS, we have our that has optimizer, that has all these ways to interpret user requirements as well as policies of providers, that then spits out these templates or these options for the users to choose from for them to optimize their non-functional requirements. And once the user makes a decision on a template, we're able to deploy it on the available federated resources, provide the monitoring interfaces, provide the necessary usable science gateway portals, and the researcher is able to monitor, instantiate, and work with the workflow. And we have actually been applying this middleware for a number of workflows in KBCommons. So this numbering is sort of messed up, but there are about 6 workflows that we have implemented. The workflows have some sort of a dependency, as you can see, using one workflow to lead on to the other workflow. And so these can be pretty complicated, from a simple workflow to a very complicated workflow. And a number of software resources, cloud resources, licenses are involved to do the processing. So we have tools to create the workflow pipeline, to schedule those resources, to have remote access to those, and we're using Cyber's APIs, for IROD, and we have our optimizers also on the system. And the kind of sequence is as follows, right? We have this, for example, RNA-seq workflow. We're able to split it into different sizes that fits into a Pegasus workflow management system. Then we're able to submit it to the HD Condor submit host, which then is the step where we do the middleware optimization. And then we're able to deploy the optimized template on distributed resources. And one of the experiments we did was, again, looking at policies from ISI, TAC, and MU. And for a given workflow for bioinformatics, we were trying to understand, where to go to compute, right? Which is the best place for having the benefits of both security and performance, and which resource would be ideal for the user. And so we did this analysis, and we found MU would be the best choice if you were, as a user, looking for performance as the non-functional requirement to optimize. And if you were concerned about security a lot, then TAC would be ideal. And in the sort of the gold option, where you want a good trade-off between both, ISI would have been the next best option, so actually the preferred option. So we were able to look at actual policies from providers, look at a given set of requirements that have a lot of data transfer and long execution processing. And we were able to say, well, if you really want to have a provisioning that's QSpecs driven, go to MU, SSpecs driven, go to TAC. But if you really wanted this joint QSpecs SSpecs allocation, you should be picking ISI to do your processing. So it's a very difficult way to do it manually. And our hope is through OnTimeURB, these kind of difficult decisions can be automated, made easier, and users have much more control on knowing where to go and what sort of experience they will get based on which clouds they pick for processing. And so here is sort of the results from the experiments. As I said, MU can give you better performance because we can get priority. It's our own cluster. If you're in a community cloud, you kind of take a ticket and stand in a line. So the processing in terms of performance might not be ideal. Whereas if you have these data transfer tools, you could actually get data faster on these larger networks than trying to get data from your lab to some sort of a local cloud, right? If you're moving data in the cloud, it's much faster. But again, if the processing and security requirements are going to be different, you will get different computation times and transfer times as you run your workflow. And here's another experiment, which is more recent experiment we ran, and we published this in IEEE IBM last year, is we looked at from a multiple cloud service provider perspective. So if we had 3 of the 6 that we implemented in KBCommons, and we had a variety of requirements from the user, which are small, medium, large scale of data and compute requirements, and we took the different cost models of different cloud providers, and we basically compared our way of brokering with a sort of a KNN template brokering. So if you had a set of requirements, if you had a knowledge base that basically had what are the right catalog of templates that would be ideal, and we're looking at the distances between the request vector and the the capabilities vector of the cloud to say which is the most closest distance, that's the KNN approach. And then our approach is using this optimizer, which I talked about earlier. And we are really, in this case, worried about cost implications of the interoperability between the CSPs. And what we found is, depending on how much knowledge you have, what sort of requirements the user has, our optimizer performs better than the state-of-the-art KNN, sort of a way of choosing the templates, and it could, essentially provide these non-functional requirements of security and performance at, a lower cost. But then, if the requirements are very strict in a security perspective, the interoperability is low, obviously the cost cannot be optimized. So this is a natural phenomenon, but we were able to model this phenomenon for these workflows, considering 4 cloud providers. And what's happening next, and Ashish and Zen and others are working on, are taking this further. So we believe that the users know best, or the users have what they think is an acceptable threshold of satisfactory workflow performance for their non-functional requirements. Can we capture that more systematically using fuzzy logic and provide a much more satisfactory computing experience? So this is sort of user quality of experience for workflows, right? So we're trying to look at these newer methods to select different cloud providers. So now I'll sort of give you the last set of experiments for the honest broker side. As I said, the problem there was we have a lot of data sources, and we really need to bring them into a sort of a community cloud where we can do the compliance checking, have this sort of trusted gateway that can bring the right kind of data and provide the access to the researchers through thin clients like virtual desktops and things like that. And we have the user interfaces that helps us do all the brokering that I talked about. And the goal here is ultimately we want to ensure auto assurance, auto auditability, which is sort of been the barrier from the usability perspective for why people take so long to give protected data access, and why even if you have access, processing the data is very slow due to a lot of these restrictions. And so how can we make it fast and secure through this honest broker service, and how we do the compliance checking, how we do the risk assessment, and how we provide the right decision modules for the data provider or the custodian to act on providing the required access to the users. So here is an example of how we're basically doing a risk assessment given a set of requirements by breaking security and aligning them to the NIST guidelines, and we can come up with these sort of compliance scores and basically quantify the risk as low, medium, high, and provide it to the data providers to make these decisions of giving access. And what's going on next is where Soumya and Ramya and Mauro are working is we're taking this idea of the trust issue of sharing this data to the next level. And also the issue of, as I said, understanding the user requirements is not a trivial process. So when it goes to a governance committee, if they had the requirements much more clearly specified, the time for actions to allow access can be shortened. So we're trying to have a chatbot interface for the workspace where the consumers of the data who are requesting the data are able to interact with. And also we're able to do a lot of trust backend work with potentially a blockchain solution. We're calling it the honest chain, where we're able to take this dialogue and then do the alignment with the compliance requirements from the provider side. And then as there's a lot of data to be brought from multiple sources, create a common data model that gets the data faster, right? It can load the data, you do the ETL process faster, and the risk assessment can check all these HIPAA, IRB parameters. And the latest version of this testbed is being done with the Cerner Healthy Data Lab, which has sort of Jupyter front ends and Spark backends. So we're hoping that this system will really greatly improve the brokering of the data in the healthcare side. So in conclusion, now what I hopefully have conveyed to you is that there is a way we can try to look at formalizing security specifications from applications, also understanding resource policies, resource requirements from users, and trying to understand how we can map them for these science gateway applications that require workflows and federated resources. And really, we can do this sort of efficient alignment of both performance and security. It can give you benefits in cost and performance and security, like I showed you. And it's ultimately giving the users the choice to deal with whatever non-functional requirements they want to optimize for. And basically, the broker should make it easy if it's a novice user or an expert user to basically use these multi-cloud resources in their applications and augment their current techniques. We don't want to replace their systems, but we want to augment their current systems with our broker. And so a nice way to conclude, we're overwhelmed with the choice today of cloud providers, and we have complex problems, science problems to solve, and we don't have time to figure out all the security performance requirements and manually do these things. And so if we can build effective multi-cloud resource brokers, we can help users overcome this overwhelming problem of cloud provider diversity. So with that, I conclude my slides, and if people have questions, I'm happy to answer.
Great, thank you very much. I totally agree with your conclusion. There are so many options out there. So while people are typing in questions, I'm just going to grab the screen back and go over a couple of news announcements regarding Trusted CI. First, please take our survey. Let me just throw this up in the chat real quick so that you can click on the link. We collect these surveys so that we could get your feedback, but also we appreciate suggestions of topics or recommended presenters. So please let us know how we did. And then next, we are doing, I pardon the typo here, we're doing a town hall tomorrow, actually. This is a short notice meeting, and I have sent a blog post about it, but I'll probably send a reminder to the announcements list. This call that we're hosting will be related to COVID-19 and its impact on securing open science. So Trusted CI is in the process of putting out some information, trying to assist the community, but we wanted to offer another way to host an open question and answer session. So this is going to be slightly different from a webinar. Instead of us delivering the content to you and you in the audience absorbing it, this is going to be an open conversation. So if you would like to join this meeting tomorrow, you could go to trustedci.org/office-hours. But I also am sending a reminder about the town hall later today. We are still accepting engagements. Our engagement application window is open. It's closing on April 3rd. So you've got a week, 2 weeks to submit your applications. And so if you're interested in submitting an application, please go to trustedci.org/application. And then I've been maintaining this slide. We have some conference updates because of the COVID-19 pandemic. For example, the IEEE World Forum on IoT in April in New Orleans has been postponed until 2021. So if you're attending that, please be on the lookout for updates. EduCause is also in April in Washington is being postponed, and it's moving online. So it's not completely canceled, but they need some time to figure out how to present it online. The GPN, the Great Plains Network annual meeting so far is still on the schedule. So please monitor that closely if you're going to be attending. PERC also is aware of the situation. PERC is in July in Portland, Oregon. There are no major updates related to PERC as of Friday. So please be on the lookout for that as well. And then we have the Trusted CI Summit in September. No updates yet. So assuming things go well, we will be resuming our meeting. And then finally, just real briefly before we get to the questions, the next webinar is April 27th at 11 a.m. Eastern. Our topic is Secure Data Architecture, Assured Mission Delivery Network Framework for Secure Scientific Collaboration. And our speaker is Arjun Duresi. And with that, let's go back to questions. We have a comment here. Thanks for a very interesting presentation. How can I learn more about the usability aspects? Should I start by reading one of the publications you cited on your slides?
Yeah, it's a great point. We have Isa and her team who are actually doing a lot of studies. And since we are still building the system, it's actually taking longer for publishing our usability research because we're trying to baseline the existing system with the developed system and its use. So the best way I would say at this point to get information from our team is to contact Isa, but we hope to actually publish some of these findings in the coming months. As you can tell, they are interested in the socio-technical aspects of this. So they are doing surveys with the providers, both the computation providers and the data providers, and they're doing surveys with the users of these systems. They're using our sort of application interfaces as a way to see what challenges are for both the user sides in presenting the requirements, also on the provider side, what motivates them to have policies that in some cases are conflicting with what the users want. So the issue of trust was in the honest broker. The issue of how do we align the policies of computational resources on the provider side, on the compute side. So they're all going to have different flavors of usability challenges, and that's what they're studying.
Thank you. Just a little bit of feedback. Someone noticed that the survey initially wasn't accepting responses, and Jim updated that setting. And so if you attempted to respond to the survey, you can do that now. I apologize for the confusion. Also, it looks like the GPN annual meeting is going to be canceled and moving online. So be on the lookout for updates regarding that. With those other updates, looks like we have another follow-up question here. For science gateways that are interested in adopting OnTimeURB, is now a good time to try, or will you be accepting early adopters in the future?
Yeah, that's a great point. So actually, we want to release the software this summer in a way that's generally usable with some examples like I showed you, so people can look into it. Since it's been sort of little fundamental research, not all of the pieces work as seamlessly, or they're all configurable easily. So we're trying to come up with a software release plan for this summer. But definitely we will have something out in summer that people can try, and at least if you're doing something related to a bioinformatics workflow or a health data sharing workflow, you'll have lots of hopefully middleware APIs that you can experiment with.
Great, thank you. Last call for questions. And a reminder, again, we are doing a COVID-19 town hall meeting tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern. I will be sending a reminder announcement to our announcements mailing list, but we also have a link to it on our homepage under events. So if you're interested in joining that meeting, please look up the event details. And I think that's the last call for questions, and we will wrap things up here. So I wanted to thank everyone for attending this presentation, and thank you very much, Prasad, for working with us under these difficult circumstances to give us a very helpful and informative presentation.
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Great. Oh, and people are saying thank you. So they appreciate you too. Okay, great. So everyone, I'm going to stop recording and then I will end the meeting. But thank you all for joining us and stay safe out there.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.